Anyway, I welcome you all here. As Daphne pointed out, probably with this group I would actually have to introduce myself. That's not always the case. I'm Al Weeble, and I talk about history and other things at the church. I have no claim to knowledge whatsoever. I hope you find it interesting. These two that we're doing on the Tuesday and the Wednesday, they do run together, but they were actually written for different purposes. So, the first one, this one I've had in the can for a while because it seemed to me very important that when you're reading the New Testament, when you're hearing the stories of, Jesus wandering around and Paul and so on, it's kind of helpful to have context. And so that's what I did that. And then when Daphne and Mary asked me to put together something for the trip, I said, well, when I looked at the materials, for those that are going on the trip, it looked like they're going to do a lot of detailed stuff on the sites we're going to visit. So what I thought I'd add to this one, which is what I'm doing tomorrow, is the history after this period up to the Oslo Accords of 1990. And it'll put it in context, you'll understand that while a lot of things you're seeing are old, they're not necessarily going way back, because we've just come through Easter, and we've heard a lot of things, and one of the titles that Jesus gets on a regular basis is Prince of Peace. Mm-hmm. I think when you watch this, when you go through this, you'll see how important peace would have been to the people of the Holy Land, because frankly, over this whole, almost 2,500 years that we're going to cover over the 2 nights, there wasn't a lot. And that's what we're going to do. So, the first one is the background to the time of Jesus the man, because Jesus is still with us, and his apostles. And I'm doing from the closing of the Old Testament to the destruction of the temple. Now, the Old Testament basically claims about the early Persian Empire. Now, the book of Daniel was probably written a little later than that, but it talks about that time period. And the destruction of the temple happened at the end of the Jewish War, 69-70 AD. So that's the period we're going to cover. We need to understand geography, because the whole sense of this history is in fact driven by geography. We'll look at some maps as we come up. But the 2 great civilizations of the area, certainly in the early times, were those based in Mesopotamia, with Babylon, Assyria, etc., and Egypt. And Egypt is still Egypt. And if you try to get from one to the other, there's only one really, I wouldn't say it's simple, but relatively simple way to do it. And that's along the Mediterranean coast, right through the Levant, which includes the Holy Land. Now, so there was a lot of fights going on. Now, when we got to the mega empires, like Persia, if one ruler controlled both ends, the Mesopotamia and Egypt, it was a lot safer. And there was a lot less activity. And under the Persians, the Ptolemies, and we'll talk about the Ptolemies a little bit later, but they were the rulers of Egypt. And the early Seleucids, who were the rulers in the early period, and we'll talk a lot about them still, of the Mesopotamian-based area. The religious policy towards the religion of Israel was benign. Under the later Seleucids, the policy was both financially and religiously aggressive, and brought forth a religious revolt, which was led by a group of family called the Hasmoneans. And as religious activists, the Hasmoneans were subject to religious criticism. And this became even greater under their successors, the Herodians, who, as forced converts of Idumea, and I never know how to pronounce that. Idumea is the area, again, we'll have maps coming up, right by Israel, which is the old Edom, if you read the Old Testament, and that's named after the people of Esau. So that's how that. We're seen by many as not true Jews. Okay. There were a lot of tramp of empires, but let's start at the beginning. Cyrus the Great of Persia gets a really good press in the Old Testament. And his successors, they don't get bad press, but those are the same guys that the Greeks, when you read the story of Marathon and stuff, didn't like. Cyrus is okay, but his successors, not so much. Had supported the return of the Judeans. And I always call them Judeans as compared to the Jews, because after the fall of the temple, the religion that we now call Judaism grew out of the Judean religion, but it was extremely different. And they were building a temple. Now, not all returned from exile, and we always talk about diaspora. That's the spread of Jews around the rest of the world, not in Israel itself. It really didn't start from the fall of the temple, but back from the Babylonian exile. So despite troubles in Egypt, because Egypt was always revolting, and difficulties with Greece, which you mentioned earlier, Persia ruled this vast area until overthrown by Alexander the Great. Alexander conquered the Persian Empire and much more. So at his death in 323 BC, he ruled from Macedon and Greece to Libya and Egypt through the edge of India. So, here is there's a pointer in here. You see the dotted line is the border of the Persian Empire at its, basically at its greatest. You can see that it does go right into Macedonia, because the Macedonians, when the Persians invaded, said, well, I'm okay with you. But they didn't ever manage to conquer Athens and Sparta. All the way, this was a truly vast empire. And they ruled this and this is a side issue, but by creating the world's best postal service. And the motto of their postal service is what the U.S. Post Office uses today. And basically, up until the invention of the steam engine, railway and steamboats and so on, you could travel as fast here as you could right up until that period in the 1800s. So Alexander conquered him, and he went even a little further. And that black line is his trip. As you can see, he went down across the Holy Land into Egypt. He got crowned as Pharaoh, and he came back, conquered India, and then he came back to Babylon where he died. So, he had this great big empire, but he'd ruled it for like a handful of years at that point. So the empire broke into many pieces, because he didn't have any adult successors. And there are a lot of them, but the three most important parts were Macedonia, which is where he came from, and he kind of ruled Greece and all that area. We're not going to talk about that any further. The Ptolemies of Egypt, and they're named after the first one, whose name was Ptolemy I. He was one of Alexander's generals, and the boy had friends. And the Seleucids of Asia. Seleucus was another general. And the whole story of that is really complicated. However, almost all areas, except in India, continued to be ruled by Greek cultural elites. So that's what, in his trail, and you've got to remember that Alexander was trained as a tutor, was Aristotle. So, I mean, he had some pretty serious Greek culture going on. Apparently he slept with, the Iliad under his pillow or whatever, and he made a big thing of stopping in Troy. So, Greek cultural elites were really important. Now, in the split, Palestine was at first under Egypt. It was taken over by the Seleucids. After Macedon became involved in the Second Punic War, that's the war with Hannibal and Carthage, Rome was gradually drawn east until it ruled all of the Mediterranean lands following the Battle of Actium. That's in 31 BC. Greek culture, though, continued to be dominant in the eastern part of the Roman rule, down to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So, and that's, of course, Turkish. And conquered Greece, this is a thing from Horace, conquered Greece had conquered the brute victor, and brought her arts into rustic Latium, which Latium, of course, is Rome. So, Antigonus, who conquered Macedonia and Greece eventually, he was finally taken over by the Romans in 168 BC. Ptolemy, Egypt, the last ruler of the Ptolemies was the famous Cleopatra. And Seleucus, he lasted till about 63 BC, and we're going to talk approaching that. No, our concern is not Seleucus and the Romans, but the inhabitants of the Holy Land. So, people don't talk much about the Seleucid Empire. You know, it's said, what's that little thing? Well, it was no little thing. That purple is it. That's in 200 BC. It was a big sucker. And of course, after that, was our friends the Romans, who conquered all that, and you can see the little bump that's Galilee and Jerusalem and Judea down here. Caused them a lot of troubles, but it may simply have been they had the same troubles elsewhere, but these guys had better writers.
That's fine.
So, the Roman Empire just started because, you know, we heard about the first census under Augustus and so on at Christmas. And it was known as the Principate, changed name later on. It had a very, very small bureaucracy. And Romans ruled largely through local elites. They didn't have a lot of troops. I mean, they had a lot of troops in absolute terms, but you saw the size of that empire. They didn't have a lot of troops for it. They were largely on the borders, on the Rhine and the Danube. So here are the emperors during our time period: Augustus and Tiberius, who get serious press in the New Testament. Caligula, Claudius, who's the guy that conquered Britain. Nero, who didn't really fit a lot of Rome burden, but he probably would have liked to. And then four quick ones in the year of the four emperors, which is 69, Galba, Otto, Vitellius, and Vespasian, who kind of ended up with. Now, we're going to talk about a whole lot of things. What kind of sources are we looking for? Well, they're pretty skinny. It's the problem of all, because, you know, there are general histories written about the Roman Empire, the Alexander's conquest, and so on, but the area of Levant is not generally highlighted. So we're dependent on the apocryphal historical works. Anybody know what the Apocrypha is? Okay. In some of the bigger Bibles, there are sections that are considered, you know, religiously reliable. Yeah, no. Yeah. And so, but you can, if you get a bunch of Bibles in the seminar library, they're in kind of like the middle between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they're far more important, for instance, for the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox than they are for us. You know, this is a side issue. Many of them are actually worth reading, either as just as good reads. But a couple of them deal with the period that we're dealing with. First and Second Maccabees, particularly. And then there was one author, Flavius Josephus, who was when the rebellion broke out that ended up with the destruction of the temple, he was a general, kid general. He got captured, turncoat, became an aide effectively to Vespasian's, but he wanted to justify both the Jews and the family of Vespasian. So he wrote lots. And because it seems to have things which are maybe doubtful, but about Jesus, and certainly about James, and about John the Baptist, the monks copied it, so we still have it. And he wrote a history of antiquities of the Jews way back, but a lot of that's just a retelling of the Old Testament, but he adds a bunch more. So those frankly are our principal sources. So, Ptolemies ruled Judea until 198 BC. Now, Ptolemy II, who, you know, as a clue, is the guy after Ptolemy the First. The men had no imagination. They were Ptolemy the First through about the 15th. The women, because there were queens, have a little more variety. They were either called Cleopatra or Bernice. But anyway, this is an important legend. King Ptolemy once gathered 72 elders. He placed them in 72 chambers, each of them in a separate one, without revealing to them why they were summoned. He entered each one's room and said, "Write for me the Torah of Moshe, your teacher." That's Moses. God put in the heart of each one to translate identically as all the others did. Now, we'll talk more about that in a second. So Judah paid a very substantial annual tribute of 20 talents, and I have no idea what that's worth. Nobody else does either. It's a lot of money. And may have thought that their transfer of 198 to the Seleucids was a good thing. In the early days, it probably was. Didn't end up that way. So, what languages did they speak in this era? Aramaic, a Semitic language, was the principal, and perhaps, and I'm always doubtful about this, only language that Jesus spoke. Though Luke describes him as reading presumably Hebrew Isaiah, and there was a lot of Greek in the area, but it had originated in the areas of Aram in Syria, which is around Damascus and Aleppo. It was conquered by the Assyrians at about the same time as the kingdom of Israel when the first exile and the 10 tribes disappeared. And their peoples were transported as well. Now, this seems to spread their language, and surprisingly, it became the imperial language of the Assyrian Empire. And it was retained by the later Babylonian and Persian empires, and spread throughout their lands. And it became the prevalent language in many places, including Galilee and important Judea, and after our time period, basically the only one. So Greek was everywhere else. Where, if it wasn't, I mean, people spoke local languages, obviously, but Greek was everywhere. It was the language of the Jewish diaspora within the Roman Empire, which was the whole eastern part of the empire, and it was a common language amongst the Roman elite. Josephus, however, tells us it was difficult to acquire it in Palestine because he tried. Hebrew was still a vernacular language. That's one that was spoken in Judea, though it was on its way to being replaced by Aramaic and became solely a liturgical language, the language that's used in, like Latin is was in the Roman Catholic Church. I don't know if it is at all anymore. Most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. A little Aramaic, mostly in Daniel, but the little bits in Ezra, Jeremiah, and Genesis. As the Eastern Mediterranean was heavily Greek-speaking, much of the diaspora was at least first language Greek, or perhaps only language Greek. Though, as I said, Judea seemed to have kept the Aramaic principally. So, the culture was a highly oral one. It was not literate. There's no way, this in no way means that they were uneducated in the scriptures. They just couldn't read them. Best, but they're not very good estimates, were that the literacy rate in Palestine is about 3%. We know Peter wasn't literate, because in Acts it tells us that, you know, he and John were uneducated and ordinary men. So if, in fact, they did write any of the books that are attributed to them, they must have done it through a secretary. It's hard to believe. They could well have had a secretary, but they. Paul seems to be, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, he wrote, "I, Paul, write this reading with my own hand." And it said Luke has Jesus reading Isaiah in the synagogue, so not only would that be in Hebrew, but he also could read it. But he could well have had it memorized, who knows. So, going back to that legend, the Septuagint, it's very important. Since the diaspora started long before the destruction of the temple, Paul was actually part of the diaspora. We get the story in Acts when there's all these people that have come up to Jerusalem with holy times, and there's, you know, Parthians and Medes and Elamites and Mesopotamians, etc. The Septuagint was the version of the of the scriptures generally used by the writers of the New Testament. If you take a look at the translation of the Old Testament and the New Testament, same passage, you will see differences. And it's because our translation of the Old Testament comes from the Masoretic text, which was, Hebrew, and the Greek writers use the Septuagint, and so the translation is effectively a translation of the Septuagint. And it can be important sometimes, because the virgin birth prophecy is not really in the Masoretic text. You can read it that way, it's not there, but it's definitely in the Septuagint. And the Septuagint remains the Old Testament of our friends in the Greek Orthodox. Except now we have the Psalms of Solomon. I know that bothers all of you that have read the Psalms of Solomon, going back to the question of who knows what the Apocrypha is. It is the source of recognized Apocrypha in various Christian denominations. So, Antiochus III, the Great, I don't know if he called himself that or what, had taken Palestine from the Egyptians in 198 BC. He now became involved in wars with the Romans, which is never a good idea back then. So he ended up paying a large tribute, and he gave up his second son, the future Antiochus IV at the Epiphanes, who gave himself, as hostage. Showing good judgment, he died soon thereafter. And he was succeeded by his son, Seleucus IV. They basically only use two names. And there's a bit of Demetrius in there too. In needing funds for the Romans, taxed Palestine heavily. So they began to think, maybe these guys aren't such an improvement on the colonies. So, he was murdered in 175 BC by his brother, Antiochus IV, the guy that was in Rome. He commenced a war against the Egyptians, and he needed money. So he accepted a bribe from the Hellenizer Jason, brother of the anti-Hellene high priest Ananias, to replace Ananias with Jason as the new high priest. He then took a bigger bribe. It means he was not an honest politician. He didn't stay quiet. From one Menelaus and replaced him. Now, when rumors of Antiochus' death, the wars rose, Jason launched a rebellion and successfully took Jerusalem. Unfortunately for Jason, Antiochus IV wasn't dead. He returned, reinstated Menelaus, and took a lot of values to the temple in 169 BC. Now, look at the names of the high priests, Jason and Menelaus. Those aren't good Hebrew names. Antiochus reinvaded Egypt, but he was stopped by a single Roman emperor. There's a great picture of that. Senator Papias Laenas, he apparently drew a circle around Antiochus and said, you either decide to go back, or you have to stay in that circle. And by then they were so frightened of the Romans, he went back. He was not happy. So he took out his anger on the Jews, looting and desecrating the temple, and decreeing the end of Judean religious practices. And he sent representatives throughout Judea to enforce these rules. This wasn't his best move either. In 167 BC, these representatives came to a small town of Modin, where a priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons had fled from Jerusalem. Mattathias killed the offending representatives and the local cooperating priest and raised rebellion. He died the next year, and his son Judea Maccabee took over leadership, which is why we talk about the Maccabean revolt, even though his brothers were also important. His principal, he had 5, but the principal brothers were Simon and Jonathan. So, here's a little family tree, which, will come around to confuse you a bit. There's Antiochus III, we talked about, Seleucus IV. Seleucus IV had a son, Demetrius I, and Antiochus IV had a son, Antiochus V, and then Demetrius I had 2 other sons, Alexander I, Demetrius II. We'll talk about them in passing. So, Judah led the revolting forces. I guess they weren't that revolting, they were just kind of in rebellion. To a number of victories, eventually taking Jerusalem, where he purified the temple. It's this purification of the temple which gives rise to the Feast of Hanukkah. It isn't just that then you did a Christmas bush time. Antiochus IV died, leaving his son Antiochus V. And they started doing okay, because they had good ministers. But then Demetrius I, son of Seleucus IV, came and killed his cousin. Judah entered into a treaty of friendship with Rome in 161 BC, which after 100 years didn't work out that well, but for 100 years, you take your chances, and it was crucial for their ultimate victory. But it didn't stop Demetrius entirely, whose forces defeated and killed Judah, who was succeeded by his brother Jonathan, who was already high priest. And then Jonathan was successful in 158. And thereafter, Jonathan played off the various claimants of the two lines, the Antiochus V and whatever. So, I'm going to have a test on this. But I actually have broken it down into a couple of pieces to give a little more detail, but I did want to show you. The top, you got Mattathias, the first leader of the rebellion. And at the bottom, you have Herod. And that's the story, basically up to the birth of Jesus. So, here's the top of that chart. Mattathias had 4 sons, and then Simon's children took John Hyrcanus. He ruled for a good long time, so we'll talk a little bit about some of his guys. So, the first and second generation of this family was very successful. Jonathan added Gaza and Ashkelon, which are 2 old Philistine cities, to Judah. But then he was taken under the cover of a peace conference. It's kind of like some of the stories we've heard about Indian chiefs up in BC. They were brought to a thing and then murdered and killed in 142. Now, a daughter of his was an ancestor of our source, Josephus. So, he was succeeded by his brother Simon as high priest and ethnarch. He was recognized by the Romans and assassinated. It wasn't really a safe kind of life being a ruler up there. He was succeeded by his son John Hyrcanus. Now he conquered Transjordan, Samaria, Galilee, and Idumea. The latter, the former, he forced to convert. So you may hear that, they weren't forcing people to convert. That's not true here. And he installed Antipater as governor. Antipater is important. In Samaria, he's reputed to destroy the temple on Mount Gerizim. Now, we all know the story of the Samaritan, in the Good Neighbor story, and the Samaritan woman at the well. Well, they were basically followers of the God of Israel, but they had a different view of it. And one of the big differences was that they had a temple on Mount Gerizim rather than the temple in Jerusalem. There were other differences in some of them. These were probably people from the 10 tribes mixed with later settlers. In 110, he finally achieved full independence because he had nominal overlordship by the Seleucids. So here's the second one. Alexander Salome, who marries a bunch of these people. Aristobulus, Alexander, and it goes down. These guys down here, Hyrcanus second and Aristobulus the second were brothers, but like some of the others in our story, they were not good brothers. And then Alexander had a daughter, Miriam, who married Herod the Great. So, John Hyrcanus, when he died, good long reign, was succeeded by his son Aristobulus, who imprisoned his mothers and brothers, and he starved his mother to death in the process. He was the first to style himself king, which caused the Pharisees, who now had appeared at this point, and they were strict religious, and they didn't like that. On his death in 103, his widow, Alexandria Salome, freed his brothers, including Alexander Jannaeus, who she married and made king. Now, he had a bunch of foreign and civil wars, and he had troubles with the Pharisees as well, but he was supported with the Sadducees, so they finally popped up. So here's a map that's kind of hard to tell. This is, when you look at the whole color, that's the Hasmonean territory. All these different colors show various times of adding. You know, like that kind of pale pink was all they really had at the beginning, and then they added on things. So as I said, they were quite successful in the early years. So on his death, his widow Alexandria Salome, which is the one that had got him out of jail, and his son Hyrcanus II was high priest. And she got on with the Pharisees, probably because she wasn't both high priest and ruler. The Pharisees really had a problem with that. On her death, her son was overturned by the other son, Aristobulus II, and they appealed the Romans, who, you know, had the same habit as the other guys. Well, I can take a bribe, but if somebody else offers me a bigger bribe, I'll switch. So they first of all picked up Aristobulus, and then went to Hyrcanus, who was returned as high priest and ethnarch. He wasn't king anymore. And his advisor, Antipater, who was the son of the last Antipater, was the son of the Idumean governor of the same name. And Antipater actually took over most of the power. Hyrcanus was eventually overthrown in 40 by Antigonus in alliance with the Parthians. The Parthians were an empire that had developed basically out of the old Persia. And if you're here tomorrow, you'll see that the Parthians had this habit of kind of invading this area. And he was taken to Babylonia for 4 years. He returned in 36 to the court of Herod I the Great, who had him executed in 30. So, in 47 BC, you guys may have seen some of these Caesar plays or whatever, where Caesar's all, you know, hanging out with Cleopatra, and he's under siege and so on. Well, one of the ways he got out of that was that Antipater sent him an army. That helped a lot. So Julius Caesar, as the ruler of all he saw, he made him a Roman citizen and eventually became the first procurator of Judea. Antipater made his son Phasael governor of Jerusalem and Herod the governor of Galilee. He was poisoned in 43, and as you recall, in 40 the Parthians came in and Phasael died during there, so left Herod the last man standing. So another test you're going to have starts with the first Antipater and ends as they peter out down at the bottom. We'll go into a little more detail. So there's Antipater, and then the two guys, Phasaelus and Herod the Great. So let's talk about Herod the Great. This is the Herod of the massacre of the innocents and so on, because there's a lot of Herods. So when the Parthians, they fled to Rome, the Romans weren't happy with the Parthians coming in. They declared him king of Jews, and he had 10 wives. But he married his second wife, Mariam, who was granddaughter of both Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. By 37 BC, Herod had conquered Judea, and when he wasn't busy killing his wives, his children, and his in-laws, he managed to manage his way through the Roman civil wars. He was loyal to Antony until Antony fell. So when you look at the map of Jerusalem, you'll see an Antonio Tower, which was named after Mark Antony, and he made no apologies for being loyal. When Augustus came by, he said, "Wouldn't you rather have a loyal guy?" It worked. And he had a really extensive building campaign. Augustus is quoted as saying, "I'd rather be Herod's pig than his son." Because Herod wouldn't kill a pig. He started a huge reconstruction of the temple. It's always confusing. We talk about the second temple. The second temple is the one that was built right after the Persian. This is also the second temple, but it's really the third temple. It's a massive rebuilding. So whenever you see reconstructions of the later temple, it's Herod's temple. Herod constructed a number of important cities, including Caesar and Maritimus and Antipatus, which is where the Romans held Paul captive. He built a number of fortresses across Judea to strengthen his defenses, and most famously Masada. I think we're all going to Masada. I have a picture somewhere. Within Jerusalem, he built a theater, which wasn't real cool with some of the Jews, and a valley just outside, an amphitheater including Greek arts. He built an ornate palace of gold and marble in the city's western district. North of the temple, he raised a massive, the little one I told you, portrait of St. Antonio, in honor of his patron, Mark Antony. He also contributed temples and buildings outside Judea. And then he died a horrible, painful death in 4 BC. It's described a number of ways, worms bursting out of him or whatever. Yeah, it wasn't good and he deserved it from every bit of it, as you'll see, aside from killings. So, I'm going to talk a bit, you probably didn't think this was going to be part of the history, about astrology. I'm sure you all checked it. So, back in the time of the Roman Empire, it was seen as a real science. It was true up until the time of the Renaissance. I've got a picture coming up showing Augustus having a coin referring to his glowing horoscope, because apparently he's a Capricorn like me. Although it wasn't practiced in Judea. Herod, who was heavily involved in this, would have been influenced. This seems to provide the best natural explanation. I mean, anything's possible with God. For the Star of Bethlehem. Aries appears to be associated with the Syrian area and probably Judea. The main symbols, sun, moon, and the 5 visible planets, are referred to as stars. There was a major astrological lunar event related to Jupiter in Aries on April 17th, 6 BC, approximately 2 years before his lengthy death, giving time to order the Massacre of the Innocents. Now I'm getting that from the book I got here on the Star of Bethlehem by a real astronomer that was looking for a reason, because, you know, when we think about it, the story in Matthew doesn't make a lot of sense. Why wasn't it noticed by anyone else? Well, you had to be an astrological scientist to know that was happening. Why did the Magi come from the east go west to follow a star in the east? In astrology, it makes sense. Why did the Magi have to inquire where to go? Well, they knew it was in Judea, and the book of Micah tells them it's Bethlehem. How did the star stand still? The Greek in Matthew is apparently consistent with the ancient astronomical description of the motion of Jupiter later in the year. It's related to the retrograde motion. You know, because our orbits are different, the planets go backwards. They stop and then they go backwards. So anyway, it's not necessarily an end, but I find it more comforting, and it's consistent with the attitudes of people at the time. So there's the Augustus Caesar coin with Capricorn. So here's the second part. There's a whole bunch of players. Agrippa, who's another Herod, who was the killer who killed the Apostle James and arrested Peter. There's Herod Antipas over here, who killed John the Baptist, and he tried Jesus in, was it Luke? I think it's in Luke that he tries Jesus. He was married to Herodias, as was his brother. He took her from his brother. And the first brother, Herodias, had a daughter, Salome, who went over and apparently was the dancer that danced with John the Baptist. Agrippa II is with Paul at Caesarea. Bernice II, who married in one of the Roman things, was Paul at Caesarea. And I think she's also the Bernice, there's several Bernices, but who became the mistress of Titus, who was the second Flavian emperor. And then Drusilla was a wife of Antonius Philippius, another governor. Now, Herod had 10 wives, and there's the names of who cares. So, the Romans made Herod's son Herod Archelaus, ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, from 4 BC to 6 CE, which is referred to as the Tetrarchy, which means 4. Tetra is 4. He was the father of Agrippa, who had mentioned killed James and arrested Peter, and Herodias, who got asked for. Now, Archelaus was judged incompetent by the Roman emperor, who then combined the very same into a Judea province under the rule of a prefect until the year 41 CE. So it's kind of a crucial time period, this prefecture. As to Herod's other sons, Herod Antipas was tetrarch of Galilee from 4 BC to 39 CE. He was the guy that killed John the Baptist. And when, in one where he said, oh, he's Galilean, Herod should try him. And Philip became tetrarch of territories east of the Jordan. Agrippa the first had 3 periods, and I mentioned them already. So we've got all this churning going on. We've got the Greek culture. We've got the Hebrew culture. We've got the change in control from Alexander to the Egyptians to they're not in charge. Sometimes things are under challenge. So we don't know all the groups that arose at the time, but we do have, and it's largely a description of Josephus. So we know of basically 6 groups. There's the group that followed John the Baptist, who according to the New Testament then started following Jesus. And of course there's a group called Jesus, which eventually called Christians. You may have heard of them. There's the Sadducees, who confined themselves largely to the written Torah, controlled the temple and the high priesthood, and tried to get along with the Romans. They were a small elite, but they were rich and powerful. The Pharisees, who, in addition to the written Torah, had an oral Torah. They had these rules that they say were passed down from the mountain, who were very scholarly and strict. They got a really bad rep in the New Testament. They probably don't deserve it because they were actually the greatest. They were the closest, probably, to Jesus' followers in some ways, though Jesus had a broader view of the world. They were much more popular with people, and the ultimate source of rabbinic Judaism. The Essenes, who were a strict and separatist group, who had at least one celibate branch. There's argument whether they were all celibate or some. They considered the temple polluted. They are likely, like 98% likely, the creators of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Zealots, who advocated armed revolt and led the unsuccessful uprising that resulted in destruction of the temple. Now, I know this is going to come as a surprise to you after you hear about people killing their brothers and wives and children, but it was a time of violence. And the Holy Land just seized with violence and inhumanity in Jesus' immediate. Being a wandering preacher challenging authorities was inherently dangerous. Some people get it because, there's all these messages of love and so on in the New Testament. But Jesus was some kind of wimp wandering around there, wearing white robes and flowing hair and not taking any chances. He was doing a very, very dangerous thing. And, he didn't have to be divine to predict his own death. It probably helped him that he did, but while our materials are, as I said earlier, very limited, they still give us many examples of disturbances against particular regimes as brutality inflicted on the relatively peaceful. So, Josephus has this long list. And on this guy, it's too small reading, but Judas, who was the son of Seraphias and Mattathias, directed the pulling down of Herod's work which were contrary to law, because he put a golden eagle, the sign of the Romans, at the entrance of the temple. Several of that group were burned alive. It was rioting against Archelaus in relation to his punishment. There was riots against Sabinus, Roman governor in Jerusalem, while Archelaus went to Rome. Jesus, son of Ezekiel, a robber. Now, this is one of those words that we see in the New Testament. Robber often meant, or bandit often meant rebel. He took Sepphoris, a major city in Galilee. Simon, who was the former slave of Herod, led a revolt and declared himself king, as did Athronges. Judas of Gamaliel, with Sadduc, a Pharisee. How about that, having a name like Sadduc and being a Pharisee? Wouldn't you rather be a Sadducee with a name like that? letter of revolt against the census, which was the beginning of the Zealots. Now, you may recall way back in David, that when David took a census, God sent, I think it was a plague anyway, lots of people died and so on. So there's religious reasons to be against the side. Riot against Pontius Pilate for his works in Jerusalem, which were certainly not respectful of the Jewish thing, and he used the temple money. He'd go in and steal the money on a regular basis. Riot against the emplacement of Caligula's statue in the temple. Caligula, of course, is the 4-year Roman Empire who was probably the craziest of all. When he married a horse, or who he'd already made a senator, you know. Theodotus, who was beheaded, and then James and Simon, sons of that earlier Judas, were crucified, and then there was the Great Revolt. So, what else do we know about Herod the Great? He wanted a great oath. And the Pharisees, 6,000, refused to swear. And then they said nasty things about Herod. And Herod heard about them. And so the king killed all of those, the principals involved, including these guys, Vatagogus and Paris. So he killed a whole bunch of them. And this is a great line from Josephus. And I'll take the time to read it. He commanded that all principal men of the entire Jewish nation should be called to him. And now the king was in a wild rage against them all, innocent as well as those that had afforded ground for accusations. And when they were come, he ordered them all to be shot up in the hippodrome, and spoke thus to them: I shall die in a little time, so great are my pains, which death ought to be cheerfully borne, and be welcomed by all men. But what principally troubles me is this, that I shall die without being lamented, with such mourning as men usually expect at a king's death. He desired, therefore, that as soon as they see he hath given up the ghost, they shall place soldiers round the hippodrome. They shall give orders to those that are in custody, shot with all their darts, and that this slaughter of them all will cause a memorable mourning at his funeral. So, you know, nobody was going to mourn for him, but he was going to make sure that there was mourning going on by killing several thousand people. So, he wasn't the knight. So, we really don't have a lot of evidence of the massacre of the innocents, but that was probably like 20 kids. I mean, it probably just didn't raise to the height of being memorable. Now, the good news, of course, is that when he died, his wife and son didn't carry out those orders. So they didn't do that. So, Herod Agrippa, you know, two down. So, we know about him and John the Baptist, right? For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. John didn't think that was a good thing. You know, it was this little thing called incest and so on. I mean, because for John had been telling Herod, it's not lawful to have you, for you to have your brother's wife, because the brother was still living, by the way. You know? And Herodias had a grudge against him for pointing out that was. I mean, I guess if she thought it was a secret and wanted to kill him. And so she persuaded Herod. Now, Josephus tells us a little story differently. Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over people might put into his power an inclination to raise rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best by putting him to death to prevent any mischief he might cause. So they're not talking the marriage, except for that when you read that part of Josephus, it's all in one paragraph, with a story about a war with his neighboring ruler Aretas, who was the father of the wife supplanted by Herodias and was really unhappy with the marriage. So I think, in fact, this is one of the few times when we have external support for what we have in the New Testament. Usually we're on our own. So, Pontius Pilate, you know, we've just read the New Testament and he's saying, I don't see any reason to hurt poor old Jesus and we'll wash it, but you know, I'm a weak man, so go ahead and crucify him. Well, that's all possible, because he was a weak man, but he was not a nice man. So, we have Josephus and we have Philo of Alexander, who was a little later, but was around at the time of Pontius Pilate. They reportedly caused near insurrections among the Jews because of his insensitivity to Jewish customs. He notes that Pilate allowed his soldiers to bring images and effigies into the city at night. Pilate had his soldiers surround demonstrators, threatening them with death, which they were willing to accept rather than submit to desecration. Now later, Philo describes a later similar incident where he antagonized putting up gold-coated shields in Herod's castle, and he quotes another incident in which Pilate spent money for the temple to build an aqueduct. Now, it's good to have water, but I don't think that's why people paid money to the temple. And when Judas again confessed his action, he gave the signal for his soldiers to randomly attack, beat, and kill in an attempt to silence Jewish people. So Pontius Pilate was not a sweetheart, and he was a ruler for quite a long period of time. So, Philo describes his personality as had vindictiveness and furious temper, was naturally inflexible, a blend of self-will and relentlessness. Referring to Pilate's governance, he described his corruption, his acts of insolence, his rapine, his habit of insulting people, his cruelty, and his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending and gratuitous, most grievous inhumanity. In other words, he didn't think he was a good guy. Josephus says Pilate's term as prefect of Judea ended after a large group of Samaritans were persuaded by an unnamed man to go to Mount Gerizim in order to see saviors. As artifacts left allegedly buried by Moses, Pilate sent an attachment of cavalry and heavy armed courier who, in an encounter with the first comers of the Lord, slew some in a pitched battle, put others to flight. Many prisoners were taken, Pilate put them to death. The principal leaders and those who were most influential. So, we're going to end up here with a little map. Again, I'm not expecting your eyesight to be good, but the problem is you've got to start with the bigger one to get the smaller one. These are kind of the key places, Jerusalem, Nazareth, whatever. You notice that they're all still pretty close together. So I divided this into half. So this part, this is Galilee. So you can see, the Sea of Galilee. Tyre and Sidon is not very far up. That's where Jesus goes for the, what was it called? The Syro-Phoenician woman. There's Nazareth where he came from. I'll bring my actual pointer. I thought there was one here. Sea of Galilee. And then down here, we've got Jerusalem and all those places around it, Bethlehem, and then Samaria is up there. Because to get from Galilee to Judea, you've got to go through Samaria, which explains a bunch of the stories. So I thought it'd be useful, and this is all in miles, for those of you that don't remember miles. 1.6 is your factor. But, Bethany, where he went back and forth, was 2 miles away. Bethlehem was only 6 miles. Capernaum was 85 miles. The Dead Sea was 6. Emmaus, 16 miles. That was a much better walk to go back and forth on. Jericho, 15 miles. Jordan River was 21. Sea of Galilee was 70 miles. From Capernaum, Nazareth was 20 miles, Tyre was 35 miles. So, for people that could walk, and these guys could walk, none of this stuff was very far away, which explains why we have these stories. I've been going from place to place, and before that, in the Old Testament, these were all close together. This is not, when we go back to the beginning, we look at the map of Persia and the Roman Empire and so on. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a very tight, boiling hotbed. And that's the end of this one. We